Good evening, everyone. I'm Jim Goldsmith. I'm covering for our normal host, Christopher Budas, because he's away. And I've got the privilege of hosting tonight's talk from Debbie Hall, all about adventures in maps. So without further ado, let's get Debbie on screen.
Hello everyone and thanks for coming along. I'm Debbie Hall and I work in the Bodleian map room, and I'm here to talk about Adventures in Maps, which is a book I wrote with the Bodleian Library featuring maps from the travel maps from the Bodleian's collections. So I will just share my screen. Now, maps obviously intersect with travel in a lot of different ways. So there are maps designed for people to find their way, like road maps and sea charts, and there are ordnance survey maps, maps made by explorers themselves showing where they've travelled and what they've discovered, and there are maps for planning travel infrastructure like canals and railways. And we wanted to include a range of these, so the book evolved into telling the stories of 20 journeys illustrated with maps, and people's travel accounts bring the maps to life. So I'm going to tell you some of the stories and show you some examples of travel maps. So first of all, this is a chart of the northeastern Atlantic Ocean. And I'm going to start with the story of the first landing on the island of Rockall, which I call the loneliest rock in the world, which is basically what it is. It's just this little tiny dot. Don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm pointing it out. And there's an account written by Basil Hall, a lieutenant of the Navy, aboard the British naval frigate Endymion, of the first recorded landing there in 1811. And he wrote a book called Fragments of Voyages and Travels about his experiences, which was full of sort of advice and edifying information for the young. And this map that I'm showing you, first of all, this is part of a 4-sheet chart of the Atlantic, which is why the title's sort of cut off. It's from 1788, so it preceded Hall's voyage, and it's called A New and Correct Chart Exhibiting the Whole of the Atlantic or Western Ocean. It was published in London by Robert Sayer. And the extraordinary thing about Rockall is that it's such a tiny little feature, but it appears in the middle of so much deep open ocean. The nearest inhabited land is the Scottish island of St Kilda, which is over 300 kilometres away. It was already known about. Hall describes it as being familiar to Baltic traders, and there are written and cartographic records of it which go back to at least the late 16th century, and there are even earlier legendary explanations for its existence. And it has a strange two-tone appearance because there are the droppings of seabirds make the top of it brilliant white, and then underneath it's dark because it's made of granite. So they spotted it in the distance, and first of all they thought that they'd seen a ship, with a rather puzzling appearance because there were white sails aloft and darker ones below, which would be unusual. But then they realised, and Hall writes, "We had been actually chasing a rock, not a ship of oak and iron, but a solid block of granite, growing, as it were, out of the sea at a greater distance from the mainland than I believe any other island or islet or rock of the same diminutive size is to be found in the world." Just have a bit of a closer look at Rockall, this slightly grubby chart. This was made in the 1830s by the Admiralty, based partly on the surveys of that time and later ones. This edition was revised in 1861. And you can see that even at that time, there wasn't that much known about it. There's a rock marked here which says Leonidas, doubtful. And there are the little views up at the top of the rock taken from different angles, which are a common feature of charts at the time and would be useful for people who spotted it in the distance to work out where they were. And there's a little note saying its summit may be reached on the northeast side, but landing is at all times difficult, as they were to discover. So back to 1811 and the first landing. They decided to explore Rockall, and they seem to have decided to explore it almost casually, just because they didn't have anything else to do. So an exploring party in 2 small boats landed, and they had sketchbooks and measuring equipment and geological hammers, and one boat took some soundings around the rock, and they were happily engaged, sort of measuring Rockall and chipping little bits off it. They didn't notice for some time that there was a slight haze gathering on the sea. And when they did, they thought it would be wise to rejoin their ship. So they returned to the boats, but that wasn't easy, because by this time a slight swell had gathered and there's a steep drop down to the sea. And so the boats were going up and down, and they all had to take flying leaps and just rely on the people in the boats to catch them. Hall describes this as being really quite alarming in the case of some of the heavier sailors. There was the fear that they might just crash all the way through into the actually quite deep ocean that surrounds Rockall. But luckily everybody was soon safely aboard, and then they set off to join their ship. But then they realised that they couldn't see Endymion. She'd disappeared into the fog. So they landed one of the more agile sailors back on the rock. He scrambled up to the top to see if he could see her. And he returned with the unwelcome information that he could not see Endymion, but he could see a fog bank which was approaching. So they made the boats fast in the most sheltered spot, and there was nothing to do but wait. Now, they weren't in a great situation. They didn't have many supplies. They were insecurely moored on a bit of uncomfortably rough sea next to a steep, uninhabitable rock in the middle of the ocean, cut off by the fog from their ship, and with no idea how long the situation was likely to last. There was a tantalising piece of false hope when Endymion came in sight, and quickly they picked up their lookout and sailed after her, only for her to go about without seeing them and disappear from sight again. By this time, they'd also lost sight of Rockall and were just in the middle of the ocean, which wasn't great. But they headed back to where they thought the rock was. Fortunately, they were right, and they found their way back with some relief, made fast again, and began making plans to shelter on the rock under one of the boats for the night. Fortunately, on this occasion, Rockall didn't become an inhabited island. Just as night was starting to fall, the fog suddenly lifted and their ship came into view. And though she was sailing in the wrong direction, the people aboard soon spotted their mistake, and they went about and made their way back to pick up the expedition party. This is a more detailed plan of the area around the rock from 1917, made by the commercial chart makers Imre, Laurie, Norrie and Wilson. Leonidas Rock, you will notice, is now very doubtful. On modern charts, I don't think it's there at all. But you can understand why, if there was any chance at all that any of these smaller rocks were there around Rockall, they would want to put them in, because if there was a rock in the middle of what was supposed to be open sea and you crashed into it in those days, your chances would not be very good. The only remaining feature of their experience now is Hall's Ledge, which is the only named feature on Rockall, named after Basil Hall. It's marked here on this map by the Royal Geographical Society, which was made in the 1970s, the only really detailed map of Rockall. And Rockall was claimed by the United Kingdom in 1955, but the claim is not universally accepted. But basically it's just a rock, so I don't think anybody's that bothered. A light beacon was installed in the 1970s, and there have been various expeditions since, and even short stays, both by people seeking adventures and sometimes by people with political campaigns they wanted to bring prominence to. And of course, the name of Rockall is familiar to many of us today, as it's one of the areas listed in the soothing tones of the shipping forecast on Radio 4. So now I'm going to remain at sea, but go back a couple of centuries. So this is an example of a portolan chart. And I expect many of you know about portolan charts, but this one is an example of an early 15th century Venetian one. Portolans were the earliest sea charts, and hence the first travel maps, because maps for travel at sea have a much longer history than maps for travel on land. The earliest extant examples are probably from the late 13th century. They have various distinctive features. They're always hand-drawn on vellum. They have room lines, these straight lines following lines of constant compass direction. And they have quite detailed and sometimes slightly exaggerated coastal features, with the names of coastal places written very closely. And then inland, there's usually very little information because they were for use at sea. Quite often there are elaborate compass roses where the room lines join, or this one doesn't have those. This is a sort of classic portolan designed to be taken to sea, bequeathed to the Bodleian by Francis Dowse in the 1830s. But the one featured in the book, I just wanted to show you this one first. The one featured in the book is a rather later one from the 16th century. This is also from Francis Dowse's collection. And this is of South America. Now, you've got the coastlines and the details of the shoals and rocks, which you would expect to find on a portolan, and the room lines and some quite decorative compass roses on this one. But there's also some exceptional inland information. We've got degrees of latitude marked, but inland, I think we're really in the realms of art rather than science. This chart's attributed to Joan Martinez, who was a miniaturist and chart maker based in Messina. And several of his charts are extant, all dating from between 1560s to 1580s. So that gives us a rough date. And the information carried on charts like this was valuable. It wasn't for public consumption. So this would have been a very valuable chart, probably not taken to sea. So we use this to illustrate the voyage of Richard Hawkins, privateer, cousin of Francis Drake, who sailed across the Atlantic in his ship the Dainty in 1593, and he reached as far as the coast of Chile, and he published his account some years later. He's supposed to be the original of one of the characters in the classic seafaring novel Westward Ho. Now, he claimed to be motivated by a desire for geographical exploration, but he was also a privateer, which was a sort of legal pirate. This was a time of conflict between England and Spain, and it was possible to make a fortune by attacking enemy merchant ships and seizing their cargo. Obviously, this was a fairly dangerous occupation, including some unexpected dangers. Hawkins recounts one story of two English ships that attacked one another in the dark because the mariners were so keen to sort of shoot first and ask questions later. But anyway, back to the chart. This is a very beautiful chart with beautiful drawings showing Martin's skills as a miniaturist. And they're not just decoration. They're showing resources to be exploited, and they're showing potential dangers. So the interior is filled with images of people, cities, animals, symbols for natural resources, including gold. All the people shown in the interior are holding some sort of weapon, and they look as if they're about to fire off an arrow at somebody or smite them with a big club or something like that. There's one of them, I think he's here, is holding a severed head. The only fairly agreeable looking inhabitants are the monkeys, who seem friendly enough. So Hawkins set off to this land of wealth and danger, and he travelled from England via the Cape Verde Islands. He went across the Atlantic, and they reached the coast of Brazil. He says, about the 18th of October, we were athwart of Cape St. Augustine, which is marked as CD St. Augustine on the chart, and it's or Cabo de Santo Agostino, as it is now. And the place names are upside down on the east coast and the right way up on the west coast, so that they would, if you were sailing from Europe, they'd be the way that you were, the right way up for the way you were sailing for the outward journey. They stopped at various places on the way, on the voyage south, including the port of Santos, which is now called Vitória and capital of the state of Espírito Santo in Brazil, where they sent ashore a note in Latin for the governor and some small gifts. And they managed to obtain some citrus fruit, which was needed for sailors who had scurvy. But the governor sent a message of apology saying because of the war between England and Spain, he could not allow any trade, and he insisted that they left within 3 days. So an intriguing mixture of sort of civility and hostility from the Portuguese governor. And they continued south. So then they went through the Strait of Magellan and up the coast of Chile. And Hawkins then describes Chile in absolutely glowing terms. He says it's one of the best countries that the sun shineth on. He eulogizes its climate, its natural resources, the gold, the copper, and the fruit and the cattle. And the expedition had a good time there to begin with. They successfully attacked the town of Valparaiso in May, and they captured and subsequently ransomed 4 ships. But then their success came to an end when, in the June of 1594, they were attacked by 2 Spanish galleons and overwhelmed. Hawkins was injured, and then he went on to spend 8 years in captivity, first in Lima and then back in Spain, before a combination of ransom and influence secured his release in 1602. And he went on then to have a successful career and had his last expedition into the Mediterranean against the Algerian corsairs when he was over 60. This chart's part of an atlas, so I'm just going to show you details of some other pages just because they're really nice. So the one on the left is from the map of Asia in this atlas, and it's got this rather charming elephant with a dragon. And also a lion sort of strolling across a green plain, and a pink animal that might be a bear or possibly a pig. So it's almost as close as we can get, I think, to a map saying here be dragons, although it doesn't quite say that. And there's also this rather lovely lion on the other side who's from the map of North America, just curled up asleep. There were lots of lovely charts like this all through the book. Now I'm going to move on now from sea to land. And this is a map illustrating one of the travels of David Hogarth, an archaeologist and gentleman scholar who ended his career as head of the Ashmolean Museum. So I wanted to include an example of a map that was about exploring new territory and following lesser known paths and perhaps more hazardous routes. And a book called Adventures in Maps had to include some explorers' maps. So this is one. This map was hand-drawn by one of Hogarth's travelling companions, F.W. Green, to show the route they took from Calfat to Malaysia in 1895, along the Euphrates River through what's now part of Turkey. And the journey begins with the crossing of the steep-sided river Euphrates right down in the left-hand corner. It's marked as a ford, and this crossing of this small feature on the map was fairly dramatic. Initially, the boat was swept away. Several people had to pursue it and drag it back. Then various things were loaded on, the men and the horses, and then the travellers looked on anxiously at the amount of water being shipped. And Hogarth says, as the tug took in her load, she began to leak ominously, but the crew made little of it, plugging a leak here and there with the end of a turban cloth, and advised us to stand as high as we could. Ferrymen then rowed them across, using what looked like punting poles as oars. And Hogarth acknowledges it was all perilous enough, but they landed safely at the little white town of Calfat. Then, after a few days' travel across the open, undulating country and another similar perilous ferry crossing, they reached Samsat, where they were given hospitality by a village leader. Hogarth was rather saddened by Samsat because it had been reduced from a small village to a small village of 100 huts when it had previously been Samosata, a capital and principal crossing of the Euphrates. Hundreds of years before, though traces of the ancient city could still be seen, there were some small archaeological finds. Archaeological exploration was the official reason for the journey, but there might have been some other motives too. At this point, the expedition split in two, and Hogarth's party continued to follow the river. The next dramatic river crossing was across the conjunction of the Kiakhta and Euphrates rivers, which is shown in the enlarged section. This was a ford, which was really considerably worse than the ferries. He says, a reckless Kurd guided us across the mouth of the Kiakhta Chai late on a stormy afternoon. The melted snows of Taurus were coming down in wild yellow eddies. He describes that the stream was 1/4 of a mile wide, and their guide took what looked like a random route across it, which was based on his knowledge of how best to avoid quicksand. So it actually sounds absolutely terrifying. He then recounts various other discoveries along the route to Malaysia, including visiting Mount Namrud, which has massive stone figures of Greek gods 8 or 9 meters high. They'd been there for thousands of years, but at the time they were largely unknown. But the motives for the journey and the detailed map are quite interesting. It was completed in 1895, and it had reached IDWO, the Intelligence Division of the War Office, by May of the same year, according to the stamp. And there's a note on it saying, all heights are from Hogarth's notes computed by the RGS. An aneroid of theirs was used. And in fact, the notes are still preserved in the archives at the RGS. So this was a serious attempt at scientific map making at a time when the area would have been largely unknown to outsiders, and then it was quickly passed on to the War Office. So although Hogarth was obviously an archaeologist and that was his reason for going there, I think spying was also a reason for the journey. Now I'm going to move on from individual expeditions and talk about mass travel, starting with road maps. Now, road maps, broadly speaking, are a comparatively recent invention, and despite perhaps being the commonest type of maps that we use nowadays, they didn't really go mainstream until the late 17th century. But this one here is one very early outlier from around 1500. So this was made by Erhard Etzlau, and it's a pilgrimage map. It's arguably the first practical European road map. It's not a general road map, it's one intended specifically for finding the way to Rome, the Eternal City, second most important pilgrim destination for European Christians after the Holy Land itself at that time. And it shows the routes to Rome from major cities, and it's a single sheet or broadsheet with a map printed from woodblocks entitled Das ist der Romweg, this is the way to Rome. So broadsheets like this were relatively cheap to produce and separately published, and so rather than being part of a book or larger work. So they tend to be rare survivors, both more vulnerable and less valuable and valued than bound volumes. 10 copies of this one are known to survive, of perhaps 200 or 300 originally made. It's got south at the top, so you can see Italy there. It's the bit sort of sticking out into the sea, and then you've got Denmark at the bottom of the map, and you've got Scotland shown rather at an angle, taken from Ptolemy, who also has Scotland on a rather strange orientation. This was produced in Nuremberg, which was a significant town for the history of map making. The Nuremberg Chronicle, of course, was published there and successfully integrated maps amongst other images with the text. And other important maps, including Beheim's terrestrial globe of 1492, were made there possibly by the same printer, Geographical. So Eslab had some really good ideas. He used dots to indicate a German mile. So where you see dotted lines on the map, they're roads, but each dot indicates a German mile, which is about 7.5 km. And so the routes and their distances are shown together. And the numbers in the margins indicate the hours of daylight available for travelling at the summer solstice. This information was also taken from Ptolemy. The total ranges from 15 hours in Rome up to 18 in Denmark, and the other border contains degrees of latitude. The Mediterranean coast is shown with reasonable accuracy, and the wonky Scotland, as I say, influenced by Ptolemy. So this was a remarkable example of an early road map, but there wasn't really very much like this, although a few people did make attempts to show roads on maps. But it wasn't really until the late 17th century that road maps took off. And this, as I expect many of you know, is one of the road maps of John Ogilby, made in 1675. Now, Ogilby was also an innovator. He came up with this strip map style where he draws the map as if it's on a scroll so that he could just show the area immediately around the road. So they're rather charming, but it's also a very clever way of compressing a lot of information because it just shows the bit that you need to see. And that means that you can have a fairly detailed map without it getting unfeasibly large. We use these in the book to illustrate the story of Daniel Defoe with his tour through the whole island of Great Britain in the early decades of the 18th century. Defoe tells his story of travels through the country, and he illuminates the points of interest and history, but he also talks about the practical challenges of travel. He gives detailed accounts of the roads he travels on. He doesn't, though, actually admit to using any maps. The only maps that appear in his books are a couple of historical ones to illustrate historical events. So this one here, which shows Gravesend and the area around, it's got a bit of a nautical theme. If you look at the decoration, you've got sort of sea nymph standing on a shell and Neptune with his trident. This was the place where sailors would often come ashore after a long voyage. And it could actually be quite a dangerous place for them because they'd come ashore, they'd be given their pay, and then they probably headed straight to the nearest pub. And then on the way home, they were in danger of being robbed and having all their pay stolen from them. And Defoe tells the story of a sailor who was robbed at Gravesend, and then the highwayman crossed the river, as you can see, could easily be done from there. And then he followed the road shown here through Tilbury and Horndon and Billericay, and then he went all the way through Essex and through Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire, and eventually he reached York so quickly that he could provide himself with an alibi for the robbery in Kent. It sounds an awful lot like the story of Dick Turpin, although it's a little bit earlier. Probably both stories are apocryphal or greatly exaggerated. Defoe gives a lot of background on the history of the places, Civil War battles, Rollright stones, ancient royal palace at Woodstock, where Henry II hid his mistress in a labyrinth. But he also talks about current conditions, such as the increase in the size of the small towns around London. So it was an up-to-date work as well. And he's very practical. He describes the state of the roads in Essex in winter as being scarce passable for horse or man. And one of the ways in which he illustrates this, which I thought was rather nice, he talks about geese who would be taken to market by being driven in flocks along the road. But once it got to around about October, they just couldn't take the geese along the roads anymore because the roads were so deep in mud that they couldn't get through. And when you think that geese have quite large webbed feet, that does make you think how very bad and muddy the roads must have been. Now, having all this information on roads, about roads on a map, obviously was tremendously useful, and people started to realise that you could add roads to maps for practical use, and people started copying quite a lot from John Ogilby. Some people copied maps of much the same type. Obviously, we see other strip maps to his design, but they were also just added to more general maps. Now, I'm going to go back slightly to an earlier map. This is an example of an early 17th century map of Oxfordshire. This is a county map. This is by John Speed, and this would have been the standard type of medium scale map, the best map you could get for most places at the time in Britain. And John Speed did not show any roads, although this is a relatively detailed map. He's got the rivers and the hills and the towns and the forests and so on, but he hasn't got any roads. But there were many reissues of his maps, apart from obviously the roads in the little town plan up at the top. But on the main map, there are no roads. His map was then reissued with various updates and changes. And then when we moved to the early 18th century, so 100 years later and after Ogilby, the roads have been added to what you can see is the same map, though it's now starting to look a little bit tired. So obviously this is a new printing from the same copper plate. So they look a bit basic because they've been slightly sort of slapped on top because the map wasn't designed to have them. But after this, increasingly roads were incorporated onto maps. And people started trying to do interesting and innovative things with roads on maps. This is a map I absolutely love, if you can call it a map. This is George Wildey's The Grand Roads of England, which was published around 1720, so just before Defoe began his travels. And this really takes the concept of a map back to its most abstract form, somewhere between a map and an itinerary. It's really a little bit like a precursor to the tube map. So only the layout of the place names, the order in which they're listed, reflects loosely their geographical position on a page with no coastlines, no boundaries of any sort. The geography is a bit haphazard. Part of Essex, I think, strays north of Suffolk. Some places, New Cross, I think, appear more than once, just because it was possible to go to different places from New Cross. So it appears on 2 routes. There's a lot of information. It's quite dense with information. There are 7 categories of settlement, from cities and archbishoprics down to post towns and villages. The distances are included along the roads, and the counties are indicated alongside. After that, I don't think anything quite like this was made for a long time. As I say, we have things like the tube map now, but I think it was really quite a brilliant idea and a way to show a lot of information in a small area. This one here, a new and correct map of the roads of England drawn by Emmanuel Bowen from 1748. This tries to combine the advantages of a route planning map and a distance table and a tourist guide in a single sheet. So a sort of condensed tour through Great Britain. So the basic structure is that of a map, but he's taken some liberties. The width of the roads is exaggerated, so the mileages can be written within the road symbol. There are settlements indicated by names along the road with no attempt at geographical accuracy, although different printed scripts were used to convey their relative importance. County boundaries are marked and hand-coloured. The coastline, I think, was probably drawn in afterwards after he'd done the roads because it looks a bit strange and inaccurate. And he clearly follows Ogilby's model because he's got the same main routes being shown, and the descriptive text referencing points of interest along the roads at the bottom is also taken from Ogilby. The short table at the bottom lists remarkable things worthy of a curious traveller's observation for each route, and there are a sort of slightly random collection of facts, such as the birthplaces of kings and celebrities, locations of antiquities, such as standing stones. He attributes the Rollright stones to Rollo the Dane, as does Defoe, but actually, of course, they're probably much earlier. So now I'm going to jump forward to 1792, so just about 50 years later. And this is another interesting use of a road map, and this was made by the engraver John Cook. And it's designed to advertise his services as an engraver. He had just recently moved from London to Mill Hill, and the map gives details in the small print paragraph that you probably can't read underneath the title. It says, "The Mill Hill errand cart sets out every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday from the Bull Inn, Holborn at 1, and at 2 o'clock from the Cock in Tottenham Court Road." So this isn't a map for travellers to find their way, although you could use it like that. It's a demonstration to his customers of how easily orders may be carried between London and Mill Hill. So it's about communications as well as physical infrastructure. And this also happened increasingly with road maps at this time. You start to get ones that give the date, the times and the days on which the stagecoaches or other early forms of public transport left different towns, which would have been very useful and hadn't happened before. Now I'm just going to jump forward still on road maps to the 20th century. I just wanted to quickly show you some examples of the maps given away for free by American oil companies in the mid-20th century. So as you can see, they've got lovely illustrations on the front, and they show natural beauties or inspiring images or wholesome families having picnics. And these were made to make road travel look glamorous and exciting at a time when car ownership had expanded enormously, fuel was cheap, nobody knew about global warming. It was a golden age of motoring that will never come again. And these maps given out as freebies are now collector's items. Just show one of the maps itself. It's actually pretty good. It's detailed and informative for such a small scale. Distinguishes 5 or 6 different classes of roads from expressways down to unimproved, and there were often supplementary maps on the back with city centres or tourist attractions such as national parks. So these were useful maps for mass travel, and really rather charming ones. Now I'm going to stay with mass travel, and I'm going to stay on land, but I'm moving to a different type of mass travel with the railways. So this is Drake's map of the Grand Junction Railway in 1839, at a time when passenger rail travel really had started to have a big social impact, enabling many people to travel further and faster than they ever had before. This one, you can probably just see the edge of a cover. It's folded in a cover. It's a little tatty. It's been used, and it shows a train being used for an interesting variety of purposes with the carriage and the luggage and so on. At the top, I do wonder if the postilion on the back of the railway carriage, though, is a bit of artistic license. And this shows the railway which joins the Liverpool and Manchester at the north. Sorry, north is to the left, which was arguably the first passenger railway, first scheduled service, which opened in 1830. The story of the Liverpool and Manchester does feature in the book, but I'm going to tell a slightly later story, that of Thomas Cook, one of the first to spot the potential of this more affordable means of travel. So this is a map from Tebbott's Guide to the Midland Counties Railway of 1840. And this is the railway on which Thomas Cook's first organised package tour took place. It was a journey for 500 people from Leicester to Loughborough. And it's an unusual map. It's engraved onto a woodblock and then printed in black so that the map shows through as the white paper. The same technique used by Joshua Archer for his county maps in the 1830s, time when people were doing a lot of experiments with printing maps. So Thomas Cook was a young preacher active in the temperance movement, and he sometimes had to make quite long journeys on foot, and he hit on the idea of buying train tickets in bulk and at a discounted price. And on the 5th of July 1841, he put this into practice, escorted 500 people on this journey, and they had a temperance meeting, and then they had games and celebrations and all travelled home. And this is generally regarded as the first package tour, and under Cook's management there were many more. So as he was a temperance preacher, and he regarded affordable travel as a more wholesome form of entertainment than strong drink, then I'd say that the origins of affordable mass tourism were really very sober and respectable, though I do wonder what Cook would think about the modern habit of combining strong drink and affordable tourism, but there we are. So this map is taken from Tebbott's Guide to the Line, which was published in Leicester a year before Cook's trip. And Tebbott's Guide conveys well the sense of drama that went with this new form of travel by train. He describes the scene inside a station as the train approaches. He says, "Everything seems instinct with life and activity. The impression is at once novel and vivid. Dispatch and courtesy mark the conduct of the officials of all grades. Great apparent bustle is manifest, combined with perfect order. The bustle increases to the instant of departure, but no confusion ensues, no clamour, no oaths. Meanwhile, the monster has given notice of his power and readiness. The bell rings, the burden is attached to the Leviathan, who glides off." So it shows a great pride in this, but also the almost alarming power of the steam engine. So then Cook went on to organise many similar train trips locally and then further afield for the general public. Within 10 years, he was taking people to the Scottish Highlands, which would have been an unimaginable adventure for all but the richest. He was popular with female travellers right from the beginning, because if they felt they couldn't travel safely or respectably without a male escort, then an organised tour provided that. And by the 1860s, Thomas Cook excursions were ranging as far afield as Paris and France and Switzerland, and then further south to the Mediterranean. This Cook's Tours map from the 1870s shows that they were crossing the Mediterranean to Egypt, the Nile, Palestine, Turkey, and Greece. Not everybody was pleased. There was a certain snobbery directed towards Cook's large, noisy groups. Some newspaper articles sneered at the idea of the lower classes being able to appreciate foreign culture, although others were more positive. Wordsworth and Ruskin had objected to the railways giving wider access to their much-loved landscapes in the English Lake District and in due course the Alps, but undeterred, Cook's tourists travelled on. There's also even a bit in, I don't know if any of you or many of you have read or seen the movie of A Room with a View. where two upper middle class English ladies are on an excursion outside Florence, and they think that their Italian driver is treating them disrespectfully. And one of them says with great shock, "He's treating us as if we were a party of Cook's tourists," as if this was a terrible thing to be thought. But it doesn't seem to have stopped the success. This obviously was an advertising poster. It's in a pretty tatty state. It's amazing it survived. This panorama of Egypt from the early 1880s shows that at a time when it was becoming a popular destination. And it looks both exotic and civilized, with a lovely green Nile Delta and the expanses of golden sand with a few oases, and you can see the pyramids opposite Cairo. By this time, Thomas Cook, Cook and Son were also doing military transport. They did have rivals to the mass tourist market, but they were a household name and continued to last for over 150 years. Now I'm moving nearer home, staying with mass travel and staying with the most basic form of travel, if you like, that of going for a walk in the country. So nowadays we think of going for a walk in the country as a thoroughly sort of healthy, respectable way to spend our time. And we probably take for granted the fact that there are footpaths we have a right to walk along and national parks, preserving some of our most beautiful countryside. But of course, this wasn't always the case. This is a lovely and quite well-known image from the cover of an Ordnance Survey map. This young man with his haversack with a map spread out on his knees and the country spread out before him like a map. And this appeared on many OS maps of the 1920s and 30s, but by this time it was becoming clear that access to walking the countryside was not straightforward. And the most famous incident for establishing rights of way in the countryside was the Kinderscout mass trespass in 1932. But the campaign to preserve open spaces and access to them has a history which predates this by several decades. So an example, this map from 1903 was published by the Wirral Footpaths and Open Spaces Preservation Society. It's a map of North Wirral, Cheshire, showing public footpaths, and it marks both established and disputed routes and common land. It's based on an Ordnance Survey map, the actual cartography, and inside the front cover there's a detailed legal statement about the law on closing footpaths and highways. It says, "A public highway closed illegally can be opened after 20 years of obstruction," naming the relevant case, and it gives advice on preserving open spaces, saying rioters' meetings are not generally so effective in such cases as organised local opposition. Interestingly, this advice is revised from a statement written from the Birmingham Association a few years earlier, so pioneering rights-of-way activists clearly understood the value of cooperation. Also worth considering is the impact of World War I. This map includes an area, Thurstotton Common, which was given to the National Trust in 1916 as one of its first memorial donations in memory of Captain Morton Brown Peyton by his brother. And there were also 14 Lake District peaks given to the National Trust by 3 different donors directly after the war in memory of those killed. And people traumatised by war or bereavement were perhaps in even greater need of the peace and tranquility of their own countryside. So back to Kinderscout. This is Kinderscout. You can see it's a very steep, challenging and open landscape. Kinderscout itself is a high plateau. This is the Ordnance Survey Popular Edition sheet from 1924. There's only a single footpath which goes nowhere near the summit or the picturesque waterfalls Kinder Downfall, and around the summit are several buildings marked shooting cabin because the landscape was preserved and restricted for those who shot game on the moors. Early campaigning by a local Ramblers Association had led to the establishment of the first legal right-of-way in 1897. This gave very limited access, a staked-off route with warning notices against trespass, and gamekeepers were a real threat to those who strayed. And significantly, it was close to some quite densely populated urban areas. Benny Rothman, who was one of the organisers present at the 1932 mass trespass, written about what a grim time it was for many local people. Unemployment was high, living standards were very low. Cities were soul-destroying, he says. There was little open space, gardens or trees. Cycling and rambling and getting out into the countryside were relatively cheap recreations. Sometimes outings would be organised by organisations like church groups or social clubs or the Scouts. But the injustice of access to such beautiful and peaceful landscapes being restricted to a few, while those from the industrial cities weren't permitted to enjoy them, must have galled many people. So on the 24th of April 1932, there was a deliberate mass trespass onto Kinderscout on privately owned land to which there was no right of access. It belonged to the Duke of Devonshire. About 400 men and women, mostly from Manchester, members of the British Workers' Sports Federation, set off up the peak. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe how they had a brief scuffle with the gamekeepers, one of whom was injured. They then pressed on to the summit and they met another smaller group from the opposite side before returning home. It was a happy occasion, but 5 of the ramblers were arrested on their return and subsequently jailed for up to 6 months for their part in the fight with the gamekeepers. This led to heightened awareness and public sympathy about the issue. There was a larger rally to campaign for greater access at Winnats Pass a few weeks later, and thousands attended and became an annual event. Ramblers Association was formed in 1935, and attempts to consolidate access to the countryside in law with the Access to Mountains Act in 1939 were not very successful, but the post-war National Parks and Countryside Act was more effective. Rights-of-way maps have been maintained by the local authorities since the 1940s, and in 1951 the Peak District became the UK's first national park. And the Open Spaces Society and others campaigned for rights of way to be shown on OS maps from 1950s, and we now take it for granted that they show that. There was also the 2000 Countryside and Rights of Way Act establishing the right of walkers to roam freely in open countryside, although its powers in England and Wales are quite limited. So it wasn't a clear path at all from the Kent Scout mass trespass to greater countryside access. It still took a few years, but it was the beginning, and the issue was then sufficiently well known for campaigners to make progress. A little poem here by Jack Jordan, who was active with the Sheffield Ramblers from 1900. It says, "Today you roam on Kinder, on paths that are yours by right, but don't forget in your roaming, for those paths we had to fight." Now, we've travelled across the surface of the planet in various ways, so I'm going to end by touching briefly on leaving the planet. So the story of the Apollo 11 expedition in July 1969, which was the first to land men on the moon, of course, is well known. But there were many years of preparation and exploration that made it possible. In the 1950s and 60s, there were dozens of uncrewed missions to the moon, which were attempted by both the Soviet Union and the United States, and some aimed to take photographs to send back to Earth before landing or crashing. Later ones tested landing technology and collected samples from the lunar surface. So I decided to look at some of that preparation, without which the successful moon landing could never have happened. So the Ranger missions of the mid-1960s sent back detailed photographs of parts of the moon, including the Mare Cognitum on known sea, named in honour of the first photographs of the moon's surface taken by Ranger 7 in 1964. The Surveyor program in the later 1960s demonstrated that it was possible for uncrewed spacecraft to make a soft landing rather than a crash landing on the moon. And also they had to establish that the surface of the moon was firm enough for the craft to land on, and that they wouldn't just sink into the moon dust, which I have to admit hadn't really occurred to me, but that probably was quite important. So in early 1969, NASA decided the best way to land men on the moon was from a support craft which remained in orbit, and which the lunar module could rejoin, the so-called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. Apollo 9 orbited the Earth to test a spacecraft of this kind, separating the lunar module from the orbiting command module before joining the two back together, landing the crew safely in the Atlantic Ocean. People thought the next one would be a moon landing, but NASA decided on one more experimental mission. So Apollo 10 in May 1969 came as close as possible to landing on the moon without actually doing so. With the spacecraft orbiting the moon, one astronaut, John Young, remained in the command module, as Michael Collins was to do in Apollo 11. Meanwhile, Thomas Stafford and Gene Cernan flew the Apollo lunar modules within 16 kilometres of the moon's surface, and a few hours later they reconnected with the command module. Now, the first moon landing, which happened shortly afterwards, was a bit like the first Rockall landing, and that there wasn't really any particular point to it. The aim was just to have done it. The USGS made basic geological maps of the possible landing sites. This one here was actually published after the Apollo 11 mission, and shows the area around landing site 2, where the craft landed, but it is largely based on information collected in advance. The original spacecraft design didn't allow for the additional weight or storage needs for geological sample collection. NASA scientist Donald Beatty wrote about it afterwards. He said, "The President's mandate did not require that any specific tasks be accomplished once the astronauts arrived on the moon. The earliest thinking was, we'll land, take a few photographs, pick up a few rocks, and take off as soon as possible," which seems fair enough, really. And this is my final image. This is a very early image of the moon made by Johannes Hevelius, published in his Selenographia of 1640, from observations made through his telescope from his observatory on the roof of his house in Gdansk. He was the first person to closely examine lunar topography, and this is a drawing of the almost full moon, which is rather beautiful. And I'm ending with this because I think the moon, it's such a lovely sight and it's a source of inspiration. It's beautiful. You see it on a clear night. It's in sight, but it's out of reach. You feel you can almost reach out and touch it, but you can't. And I think that sense of inspiration and reaching out for something beyond the everyday is the thing that always leads us on adventures, big or small. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you so much. If anyone's got any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll go through as many as Debbie's got time to answer. I definitely know what's going on my Christmas list this year. That's definitely going to be top of the list. Can I please have this book for my Christmas present? Presumably,
I can always put a link to where you can buy it
that'd be brilliant. Yeah,
in
I
the
was,
chat as
going to
well.
ask you that. Yeah,
Yes.
where it's available from. That'd be really
It's
useful.
available, of course, from all good bookshops, but this is the link to the Bodleian shop.
The Bodleian one. Okay. We'll have a look at there first then. Brilliant. One of the maps I definitely have an interest in while we're waiting for questions to come in was the Intaglio one of the railway. So,
yes,
yeah, fascinating. Presumably the colours were added afterwards.
yes. So it's printed in black, and the white lines that show through are the railway lines. So that's the whiteness of the paper showing through. So it's engraved on a wood block, which of course you wouldn't normally do. Woodblock printing is usually the other way round, with the bits that should print being left in relief. And then there are some colours added to highlight towns and so on, but they are added by hand. Yes, it's a very unusual technique, and it seems to have been used for just a few other things. There were a small number of county maps produced that way, but presumably for whatever reason it didn't catch on. It doesn't have the precision of a map engraved on metal. So perhaps for that reason it hasn't been widely used. But yeah.
And uses a lot of ink as well.
Yes, that's true. It would use a lot of ink.
Yeah.
I don't know how difficult it was to do.
No, I don't know either. Yeah, fascinating though. Someone's put in a comment about the Royal Footbaths and the Open Space Society are still going. They had
Fantastic.
their AGM last week.
Oh.
So that's fascinating. Thank you. Simon Ritchie says, I'm old enough to remember back to the early 1960s and the worries about sinking into the thick layer of dust that was thought may cover the moon.
Well, I must admit that had never occurred to me. But actually, if you got to the moon and sunk into the dust, it would be really bad, wouldn't it? So
it would. Yeah.
You can see why they had to check that out, both that it was possible to make a soft landing without, crashing, but also that it wasn't so soft that you just sink into it. So yeah, all these things that you don't think about, take them for granted.
And at least they proved it wasn't made of cheese.
They did.
Wensleydale.
Yeah, so that was good too.
Right. Anyone else got any questions at all? If not, I would just like to thank Debbie ever so much for your time and a fascinating presentation. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Christopher will be back for the next Teatime talk in June. I think it's the 19th. I've got all I got the details about it. Yeah, so it's the perspective of a geography teacher and how I use maps as tools for learning, application, and creation within geographical topic and concepts by Tristan Willis. So remember to book your tickets for that as and when they go up on Eventbrite. Right, everyone else is saying thank you as well, Debbie. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
It was a marvelous chat. I agree, 100%.
Hope people enjoyed it, and do feel free to buy the book.
We do, and I will definitely be putting that on my Christmas list, as I said, and get that. Yeah, and thumb my way through and read all the other stories that he hasn't had a chance to tell us about.
Yeah.
How many stories in total are there in the book?
There were 20, although some of them I try to go off at a tangent slightly because I wanted to, include a different interesting map or whatever. But 20 sections.
20 maps. Brilliant. Thank you. Right then. as there's no more questions, thank you very much for your time, everyone. It will be posted up on YouTube, so tell your friends about it if they didn't have an opportunity to attend tonight. And we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks very much.
Bye. Thanks, Debbie.